I started learning Chinese more than 15 years ago, and here are 3 things I wish I had known back then as a beginner. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to discuss 3 things that I wish I had known as a beginner, and by extension, these are of course things that I think you ought to know if you are a beginner, or even an intermediate learner. I actually launched Hacking Chinese in the first place to try to answer the question of how to learn Mandarin in a better way, so in a sense you can think of all the articles and podcast episodes as trying to answer this question. Today, however, I've chosen things that are particularly relevant for beginners. This is part 1 in a series of episodes where I'm going to pretend that I have a time machine so I can go back in time and talk to an earlier and less experienced version of myself. In this first installment, we will go back to 2007 when I started learning Chinese, and in subsequent episodes we are going to visit my older self as an intermediate learner and as an advanced learner as well. You don't have to be familiar with the story of how I learned Chinese to benefit from this series, but if you're curious, you can check the link in the show notes to How I Learned Chinese Part 1, where it all started, which contains an overview and a table of contents with links to all the articles and episodes. But like I said, you don't have to know about that. I will obviously not choose things that are only relevant to me personally, but I've tried to choose things that will be relevant for most listeners. One thing I'd like to say before we get started is that it is notoriously difficult to describe language proficiency, so you might have already asked yourself the question, what does it mean to be a beginner here? And this is a very rough division, but I consider myself a beginner for my first year of learning, then as an intermediate learner for at least 3 or 4 years, and then an advanced learner from then on out. This roughly corresponds to the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, CEFR, levels A, B, and C. So let's power up the time machine and go back to when I was a beginner. If I were to summarize the advice I'm going to discuss today in one sentence, it would be venture beyond the classroom. I think a classroom is a great place to start learning a language. Everybody knows as much as you do, and the language is introduced in bite-sized chunks at a reasonable pace. And if you have at least a moderately competent teacher, learning Chinese will be meaningful, interesting, and even fun. The problem is that for a vast majority of cases, simply enrolling in a course will not teach you what you need to know. Confining yourself to the classroom is like splashing around in the shallow end of the pool when your actual goal is to scuba dive to the shipwreck in the deep shark-infested waters of the coast. As long as you keep to the shallow end of the pool, you will feel that you are doing great, you can perform all the tricks in your textbook and jump through all the hoops presented by your curriculum, and at the end you might even get a paper saying how great you are at Chinese. Yet the moment you step outside of the classroom, all this will come crumbling down, because you'll realize that your Chinese isn't really as good as you think it ought to be. This is not just because real-world Chinese is harder than textbook Chinese, of course it is because you are not preparing for the right things. So for example, if you learn to swim, splashing around in the shallow end of the pool probably won't do you much good. So stepping out of my time machine, I would tell myself to get out of the classroom. Because for my first year of learning, I didn't do that much. I was very good at following instructions. I studied everything that the teachers and the course presented to me. I did so quite well and remembered most of it and got very good grades. But I didn't do much more beyond that, and I was naive enough to think that following the curriculum and doing everything would be a great way of learning Chinese. But it turned out to not be enough. That in itself is not very helpful, so what I will do now is break this down into 3 separate pieces of advice and discuss how you can apply those to your learning right now. I do also want to mention that if you want more carefully structured advice in the form of a video course, I do have a course called Unlocking Chinese, the ultimate course for beginners, which contains everything you need to know to get off to a good start, or to fix a bad start if you happen to have one of those, including things like pronunciation, how characters work, how to learn these things, and much more. You can learn more about the course by using the link in the description or by going to hackingchinese.com/courses. Okay, so let's get started with advice number 1, go beyond your textbook as soon as possible. In a sense, a textbook is like a carefully designed house of cards. Each chapter is built on what was presented in the previous chapter and only that, and then you gradually build up to a more advanced level using everything that you've learned previously. This means that your card house will grow taller, but it also means that it will contain lots of holes and lots of air, and even just shaking the table a little bit might bring it all down. The problem here is that what determines how well you can use Chinese in many contexts is how well you know it, not just how much you know. An example of this is that textbooks don't contain that much Chinese. So if you add up all the Chinese characters in a textbook, and I'm not talking about unique characters here, but actual Chinese characters, the total number is surprisingly low. That is because most of the things in a textbook are fairly difficult, and you can't have long, difficult text because they will take forever to go through. If you compare this with something like a graded reader, you will find that they contain much, much more characters, but that they don't necessarily get harder all the time. So this means that textbooks grow difficult rather quickly, i.e. building your house of cards, but if you pair this with other things, such as graded readers, you will be able to fill in the holes in your card house. Another related case we can use to illustrate the problem with textbooks is that if you take a word that is moderately common, i.e. we're not talking about the most common words such as pronouns and the basic verbs and so on, because those appear all the time, but all the other words, they basically only appear a few times in a textbook. This means that even if you memorized everything in a textbook, and I don't recommend that you do that, but even if you did, you would still not have the information you need to know in order to use these words, because you need to see them in many different contexts. And you don't even know enough to understand the words, because that also requires a variety in the type of input you get and the type of sentences that these words are used in. So the conclusion is that you should start listening to and reading Chinese outside of your textbook as soon as you can. Now, I think that textbooks are reasonably good at introducing the basic language, so the first half, say, of a beginner textbook contains the most important characters, the most important words, the grammar, and so on, and there is no harm in studying these things first. The point is that as soon as you have enough characters and words down to be able to read something else, and we're talking maybe 50, maybe 100 characters here, you can definitely start looking at other learning materials. Actually, you can do this even earlier if you use more than one textbook, so you study 1 or 2 chapters in the first, you move to the second and study chapters 1 and 2 there, which won't make things much harder, but you will get more breadth and different types of sentences and contexts and so on. If you want to learn more about that, you should check out episode 95, where we talked about using more than one textbook. As already mentioned, you should definitely check out graded readers, and this is not just for reading practice, but also for listening practice. These are great because they are not meant to introduce too much new vocabulary. Indeed, it's a point made in these books to keep it limited to a certain number of characters. So for example, maybe the lowest level in a graded reader series requires you to know 100 or 150 characters or words. Maybe it's a bit more than that depending on the series, but the requirements are not that high. And the point is that these don't get harder the more you read. So if you keep reading a textbook, it just keeps piling on new words and it gets more and more difficult. But a graded reader is the opposite. It is the hardest at the beginning because you need to know certain words to get into the book, to the context and to the characters. But once you're started and once you're moving forward through the book, you will find that you will encounter less and less new words and characters. And this is exactly what you need to really master the things you've learned in your textbook. The next tip here is to check out beginner podcasts, but here I also want to add a word of warning, because many beginner podcasts for Chinese learners contain mostly English, and that does not count as listening and reading practice. If the episode is 15 minutes long and it contains a 30-second dialogue in Chinese and the rest is in English explaining the words, the grammar and so on, this does not count. This is not what I'm talking about here. That might be nice to listen to, maybe it might give you some insights, but it does not count as a reading and listening practice. There are many resources that actually do use almost entirely Chinese and are beginner friendly, but most of these are in video format because you need support of some kind if you can't speak English. And I've summarized most of these in 2 articles that I strongly recommend you check out as a beginner and also as an intermediate and advanced student actually. These articles actually do have podcast episodes too, but since they are list of recommended resources and I also update these, I suggest you check out the written versions and I'll put links to those in the description of this episode. The first one is called The 10 Best Free Chinese Listening Resources for Beginners, Intermediate, and Advanced Learners. The other one is called exactly the same but with listening instead, so The 10 Best Free Chinese Listening Resources. Finally, there are also a bunch of apps out there that are meant to help you with reading and listening, but mainly reading, and here I can recommend Do Chinese, for example, or The Chairman's Bow. There are also plenty of websites that offer this for free, and I've collected those in the articles I just mentioned, so check those out if you don't know what to listen to or what to read. When I started learning Chinese, none of these resources existed, and so I have a good excuse in that sense. But on the other hand, if they had existed back then, I doubt that I would have checked them out, because, like I said earlier, I didn't realize that I needed to move beyond the classroom, but you really need to do so. And you have no excuse, because I've collected all the resources you can use for free in those articles I just mentioned. So let's continue with beginner Chinese advice number 2, which is to interact with real people earlier. When I say real people here, I mean people who are not your classmates or your teacher. There are different approaches to learning foreign languages, so if you search for how to learn a language quickly, you will find some people who say that you should speak from day one, and you will find other people who say the complete opposite, that you should focus mostly on input, i.e. listening or reading, before you start speaking too much. There's also debate in the Chinese language learning world whether or not you should learn the spoken language before the written language, or if you should learn them in parallel. I will return to the first of these questions in a bit, but the second one I think is fairly straightforward, and it's something we covered in the first episode of the podcast, and the answer is that yes, you should normally focus on the spoken language first. It comes with almost no downsides, whereas if you delay focusing on, say, pronunciation, learning tones, and so on, this is something you will probably regret later. So let's turn to the question of how early you should start using Chinese to communicate with real people. In general, I think that input is much more important than output, so listening here is more important than speaking, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't speak at all. This is particularly important if you want to make quick progress and be able to speak with people in your surroundings sooner rather than later. This is a great example of how adult second language learning is very different from child first language learning. If you think about it, children spend a year or two just listening first, and then they gradually learn to speak, but it takes years for them to even be able to put together decent sentences. But I've met people who've studied Chinese for 3 months and are able to talk about everyday topics just fine. So there are a few reasons why I think speaking is a worthwhile activity, and some of them are more obvious than others. So to begin with, some things are skill-based. So for example, navigating a conversation and knowing when to say what, it's something that requires practice. Even if you've listened to many people do this, being able to know when to say what and when to ask someone to slow down and use other types of strategies in a conversation is something that requires practice. Pronunciation would be another example of this, because even though listening is great, and it is in fact what I recommend you do the most as a beginner, because you need to know what something is supposed to sound like before you start saying it too much yourself. But you won't simply emerge with perfect pronunciation without having practiced yourself. Well, if you were a child, you would, but you are not if you're listening to this, probably, and so you shouldn't expect only listening to work here. If the average adult learner could just absorb Chinese pronunciation by listening to it, everybody who has lived in China for a few years would have perfect pronunciation, but I can tell you that they do not, and good pronunciation is actually quite rare, even among people who have lived in China for a very long time. Then there are a few less obvious reasons why communicating is a good way of learning, and the first one is that communication guides your learning. When you talk with other people and you listen to what they say and you have conversations, you realize what you're good at, and more importantly, you'll realize what you're not good at, and you can then target your practice, your studying, and so on these areas, on the weakest links in your chain. The second reason communication is important is because it's motivating, and that's because it's connected to the normal standard goal for learning Chinese, which is, of course, to be able to talk with Chinese people. So if you start doing that early, you will feel that you're getting closer to your goal. You can say some things, you can convey some ideas, and this is motivating. The third important factor with communicating with people outside of your classroom is that the communication then becomes authentic, meaning that it's not created only for you and specifically to teach you some things based on what you already knew. Well, of course, if you're talking with a reasonable person, they will adjust their Chinese because they know you're a beginner, but they don't know exactly which words you have studied and they don't know what your house of cards looks like, so they have to guess a little bit and then they will say things that fall into the holes between the cards. And this is very helpful because you can then plug these holes and solidify your foundation, which will enable you to communicate much better in future. Another advantage with communicating early is that communication usually is meaningful. I'm trying to tell you something you didn't already know, and you will reply with something I didn't already know. Whereas if you stay within the classroom, most oral practice is of the kind where we don't actually exchange any information. There's kind of meaningless, it's just a drill or something we do in order to learn. We read a dialogue, we read a text. Maybe we have a role-playing activity where we all know the answers in advance. And this is not really meaningful, we are just focusing on the form of the language, not the content. So when I was a beginner, I learned Chinese in Sweden, so I didn't live in a Chinese-speaking environment, and I waited an entire year before I started talking with people outside the classroom. And that sounds crazy to me in hindsight, but I was doing quite well in my course and I didn't see any reason to do anything else. But now, looking back, I would definitely tell myself, hey Oleg, go out, do something else, communicate with people so you know how you're doing and what you should improve, and so on. Had I done so, some things later would have been much improved. For example, I think I would have realized that listening is a real problem in Chinese, and I would have spent much more time listening if I realized how hard listening is outside the classroom. So I was an introverted learner back then, and I still am today. I don't really enjoy talking with strangers unless I have something interesting to talk to them about, and I don't spontaneously make friends either. That means that the advice to me is definitely to speak more with real people, but how you apply this to your own learning depends a little bit on your personality. So if you're introverted as well, you should probably heed the advice I just gave. But if you are an extroverted person who do these things naturally, maybe the advice should actually be the opposite, to spend more time on especially listening and reading. Don't focus too much on speaking yourself, because if you think about it, speaking doesn't really teach you anything new about the language. You can only say things you already know. Whereas if you read and listen, you can learn new things about the language, new words, new sentence patterns, and how they are used. Before we move on, I'd like to highlight episode 126, where I shared 8 tips for introverted language learners. We have now reached beginner Chinese advice number 3. Make sure you learn pronunciation properly. To the uninitiated listener, this might seem like it has nothing to do with venturing outside of the classroom, which I said could summarize all the advice I'm going to talk about in this episode, but actually they are related. The reason for this is that pronunciation is usually covered in a very poor way in most formal courses, including those at universities. You typically learn pinyin and tones in the first few weeks, and then sometimes they are just forgotten about and never covered again. And if you're lucky and have a teacher who cares about your pronunciation and can help you with that, that's great, but usually this is not what happens. This is really the topic for a separate episode, but most Chinese teachers will not correct your pronunciation much. And this is because we as students have kind of conditioned teachers to not do this. There are many students who get defensive and even angry when they get corrected, and some students simply don't care about pronunciation at all. So if you're a happy, positive teacher and you want to help your students, but sometimes you just get upset reactions or even anger in return, you will simply stop correcting people's pronunciation. And sometimes maybe you think someone is a lost cause if they make the same mistake with a third tone over and over and you try to fix it and they don't improve. You just stop reminding them. And this is how you can have people who have studied Chinese for years in formal education and still have horrendous pronunciation. I don't mean to say that this is fully the fault of the teachers, of course, even though I still think it is the responsibility of the teacher to at least try to correct these things if they are very serious, but I do think it's something you need to know as a beginner. It's not something you can count on your course or teacher to cover well, and hence you need to venture beyond the classroom for this as well and take responsibility for your own learning. This is of course extremely unfortunate, because if it is one thing you should learn as early as possible, it is pronunciation, because the longer you learn, and especially if you learn incorrectly from the beginning, the harder it will be to change later. Whereas if you learned, say, a character incorrectly, this is relatively trivial to fix later. I will share some insights on how to learn pronunciation as a beginner, but you can also go to Hacking Chinese and simply search for pronunciation, because this is something I've written about quite a lot. The most important thing is that you learn pinyin properly. You should never assume that you know something if you don't. You cannot guess the pronunciation of completely unknown syllables, and you should never assume that letters are pronounced the way they are in your native language. Don't make the mistake of thinking that pinyin and the sounds are the same thing. I mean, pinyin is just a way of writing down the sounds, so you can learn to write things even though you can't pronounce them, and of course you can also pronounce them without being able to spell them. But if you mix these up, your pronunciation will suffer. For more about the link between the spoken language and the written symbols in pinyin, you can check out episode 38. And if you want to know more about the most common traps and pitfalls when it comes to learning pinyin, you can check out episode 76. When I started learning Chinese, I did reasonably well with pronunciation, at least well enough for teachers to not comment too much, but later I figured out that I had some major issues, especially with third tone, and that took hundreds of hours to fix. And if I had cared a little bit more and taken pronunciation even more seriously from the beginning, I might have avoided that entirely. If you're curious about the third tone issue, you can check out episode 26. To make this a little bit more practical, here are some suggestions for how to work with pronunciation as a beginner. Number 1 is to listen and pay attention. This is essential, and you need to listen a lot and you need to pay attention to what you're listening to. Without having an idea of what Mandarin is supposed to sound like, you won't be able to reliably pronounce it correctly either. Number 2 is to mimic native speakers, and there are many ways of doing this, but the one I recommend, and also happens to be completely free, is to find some audio that you want to mimic that sounds like you want to sound, and you try to mimic it as perfectly as you can. You have the audio file, you listen to it, you repeat after it, you repeat in tandem or in chorus with the person speaking, until you can say it exactly like they do. You produce your own copy that should be identical to the original, or at least as far as possible, and then you can check for differences and maybe ask someone for feedback. How am I doing here? Number 3 is to understand what you're doing. You are not a child, and you will probably not automatically learn perfect Chinese pronunciation without trying to, and so understanding what you're doing can help you pay attention to the correct things, and it can help you notice some things that your ears or brain fails to hear. Number 4 is to get feedback, and most students who think they are doing well with pronunciation actually aren't, and it could be the case that you happen to be one of those who are really good at mimicking and your pronunciation actually is very good. But the problem is that you can't hear this yourself as a beginner, and you need feedback from other people to determine this. If you want to learn more about Mandarin pronunciation, all the things I mentioned here have their separate episodes and articles on Hacking Chinese, and I'll put links in the description. If you want more structured advice, I have constructed a video course that covers everything you need to know about Mandarin pronunciation, not just as a beginner, but as an intermediate and advanced student as well. This covers all the initials, all the finals, all the tones, and it also covers things like stress and prosody, and of course how to learn all these things. There is also a feedback option where I will give you systematic feedback on your pronunciation, either as you are learning it if you're a beginner, or as a more comprehensive check if you've been learning Chinese for a while and want to know how you're doing. For more about that, you can go to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. So as the time machine is winding down, let's conclude this episode by saying that beginners don't get stuck in the classroom. I know that many students learn Chinese roughly in the same way as I did. Not all of you are doing that, but many of you are. And if you are, you need to leave the classroom. This is actually true for people who live in a Chinese-speaking environment as well. It's just that leaving the classroom in order to learn more Chinese is much easier if you have Chinese speakers all around you, of course, compared to if you live in Sweden or Utah or South America. If you have any questions about learning Chinese as a beginner, I have an FAQ, which I will link to in the description. If you're not a beginner and you've listened this far, I'm curious what you think you did wrong as a beginner and what advice you would give yourself if you had a time machine. So please head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.